I'm Vice President of WISE, of Women, Science and Engineering at UCSC that puts on this event. And I am very pleased today to introduce Glenn Stewart, who is the director of the Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Research Group, which is located at the Seymour Center at Long Marine Lab. And I was very impressed to find out that he's been working with the Predatory Bird Research Group since 1976, when it was founded by Professor Ken Norris, who's well known in Santa Cruz. He's worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to study the impacts of the Exxon Valdez oil spill on bald eagles in Alaska. From what his website says, he mostly now works on peregrine falcons around the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was interested to find out that he also consults with vineyard managers on using falcons to reduce bird damage. So hopefully we'll hear lots of interesting things tonight. Thanks, Glenn. And I don't know
Chris, I need to move this.
Yeah, I think he sized it for me, not you.
It's this way. There we go. That's better. Great, thanks. Great to be here. I've never spoken to a drinking crowd before. I'll do my best. Can we move this too? There we go. It's okay. My talk will probably sound better because of that. The genesis of this talk is this. Is that working? That's better. When bald eagles started showing up at Crystal Springs Reservoir and Pinto Lake, because my name is right next to the words predatory bird research in the phone book, I started getting calls from the media about this blessed event, bald eagles showing up. And the Sequoia Audubon Society called me and said, well, could you give us a talk about bald eagles? And I said, well, would you like to know where the eagles came from? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is the backstory on the reemergence of bald eagles in the Central Coast area. This picture is taken from the Coast Ridge Road, which is a 16-mile long dirt road that goes from the Ventana Inn in Big Sur, climbs to the ridge, and goes all the way down to what became a release site for bald eagles and now for condors. It's the home of Ventana Wildlife Society. I have to think about the name because they've changed it 3 times since I was director there. It was anyway, it doesn't matter what it used to be. But we release bald eagles there, now they release condors there today. And it's a beautiful site, and so this is a story of how we started releasing bald eagles, where the eagles came from, and how they've done over the years. Bald eagle is a uniquely American bird. It's found only in North America. They're well known for catching and eating fish, but they're universal feeders. They eat ground squirrels. They eat waterfowl. Down Lake San Antonio and Nacimiento, they eat a good many coots because that's a prevalent bird down there. So found all over North America until about the 1940s. They nested all along the Alaska coast, all along the Pacific coast, in fact, from Alaska to Baja. There's a historic nest in Malibu Canyon in a sycamore tree, all up the Big Sur coast, on up into Oregon, Washington, and Canada. So, of course, by 1980, there were none left nesting on the coast of California at all. In California, we could not find a bald eagle nesting south of Shasta Lake. So, like the peregrine falcon, they were pretty well extirpated. And of course, like all good stories, we have a villain in this story, and that's DDT. And we had to get past that, but we also had to keep the bird from going extinct and restore the population, the same as we did with peregrine falcons. So this is the villain. DDT is, as you probably all know, was used very widely, or you may not know because it was a while ago. From the post-war period, we used DDT during the war, World War II, to protect soldiers in tropical regions from malaria. We were able to do that very effectively by spraying it everywhere the fighting was occurring, and it was found to be very effective at combating mosquitoes and malaria. So after the war, we used it pretty much everywhere. We sprayed it on any water course or low-lying water area or swampy area, and it worked really well there. So we thought, well, gee whiz, there's mosquitoes in neighborhoods, so we sprayed it in the neighborhoods. And we sprayed it where kids were playing and swimming and picnicking, and it worked really well there, wiping out mosquitoes. So we sprayed it on forest lands that where we wanted to wipe out the bark beetle in forests. And so DDT was used throughout the country and really throughout the world, and wiped out peregrine falcons, it wiped out bald eagles by a kind of a weird biologic quirk. The DDT, when it's metabolized, inhibits the movement of calcium inside of a bird's body. And by doing so, it causes them to lay a thin-shelled egg. When the ova, the egg or the ova, comes down the oviduct, the last thing that happens is the shell is laid down around it 24 to 48 hours before it's laid. So if you slow down the process of the movement of calcium, we ended up with eggs that were 20% thinner than nature intended them to be. So this is a picture of eggshell, normal thickness here, and then after 20 years of DDT use, 20 or 30 years of DDT use, eggs are 20% thin. And so we use the stuff everywhere, and we ended up with thin eggshells that never hatched and diminished populations of predatory birds. Top of the food chain, the effect is the greatest on eagles, ospreys, peregrine falcons, pelicans. All those birds suffered as a result of DDT. So that was the problem. And so what are we going to do about this problem? First thing is the discovery of the problem, and Derek Radcliffe is the biologist in Great Britain who studied peregrine falcons along the, throughout Great Britain, and made the connection between DDT use and eggshell thinning. And that was about 1960 he did his work, 1961 he published it. So we knew about the problem then. Rachel Carson wrote her book, Silent Spring, in 1962. It was published. And so it became well known to the public. In 1964, there was a conference in Madison, Wisconsin, where scientists got together and discussed the problem and tried to figure out what to do about it. And then in the same year, peregrine falcons were surveyed throughout the eastern United States. No peregrine falcons were found nesting east of the Mississippi River. So we knew that there was a genuine threat of extinction. So the real hero of this story is William Ruckelshaus, who is the first director of the Environmental Protection Agency, and he banned uses of DDT in 1972. So we figured out the problem 1960-61. By 1972, we had the beginning of a solution. 1973, we passed the Endangered Species Act, which created a framework for actually doing something to prevent the extinction of birds like bald eagles and peregrine falcons. So I just wanted to spend about a half a dozen slides here looking at the peregrine recovery effort, because that's what we modeled the bald eagle recovery after. What we did to help at UC Santa Cruz to recover peregrine falcons was first we we gathered up the peregrines that we could find and held them in captivity in breeding aviaries and attempted to breed them. And most people said, well, this is never going to work. In fact, the federal biologists, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, tried to breed falcons in captivity at Patuxent Wildlife Reserve and could not do it, and gave up on it, said it couldn't be done. So it came down to really a small group of driven people who thought they could make a difference in the world. And that was Cornell University on the East Coast, which was a group that became known as the Peregrine Fund, and at UC Santa Cruz, the Predatory Bird Research Group. We climbed cliffs, we recovered eggs at nests where the eggs have been breaking year after year due to DDT-induced eggshell thinning, and we took these eggs up, as Lee is doing right here. That's peregrine nests, those are eggs, and we climbed down there with a wooden backpack and Tupperware containers with foam rubber linings that we'd place the eggs inside of. Egg, foam rubber, egg, foam rubber. And the wooden backpack was to protect the eggs on the way back up the cliff in the event that a rock fell. We were able to incubate these eggs in a wet incubator and get them to hatch. The only problem with the eggs was the thinness of the shell. If we could hatch the eggs, the babies inside were just fine. So that's a newly hatched baby. We grew the babies in these tubs with corncob bedding, and underneath the corncob was a very precise heating pad that kept the babies at the right temperature. And so we were able to grow all these babies, and we were able to produce a lot of youngsters. Somebody's laughing over here. They're funny looking little critters. I'm convinced that Steven Spielberg was looking at that when he created E.T. And they're all full of food, I'll point out. This purple bulge right here, that's the crop. And that, when they're full of food, that bulges. Most raptors have this extra organ, most raptors do. It allows them to gorge on food and then move the food down into their stomach slowly in order to eat 3 meals at one sitting. So what we did is, with the peregrine recovery, is we took those babies down into the nest. I forgot to tell you that we left dummy eggs in the nest for mom and dad. So they stayed there, incubated these dummy eggs, and we came down later, swapped out the fake eggs for the babies, and they raised them. So that's how we got peregrines back in California, by managing nest sites. The other way was because we had more babies than we had places to put them, we released them from these release boxes that were mounted on cliffs in places where peregrine falcons once nested, but had been driven away by DDT, and had folks that would sit out in the middle of nowhere and babysit these babies by putting food out for them day after day, kind of secretly delivering food. In this case, through this tube up here, we'd send thawed out quail down to them. And they'd come back and eat the food that miraculously appeared every day. And it took about 6 weeks, and we called that a hack site or a release site. And so it was upon this program that I proposed to the bald eagle working team in California that we model a bald eagle program after the successful peregrine program, because this worked very well. Of course, by now we know it worked. This was back in the 1980s when peregrines were about here, but we can see the increase happening. We knew of 2 pairs of peregrine falcons in California in 1970, and last time we did a survey, there are 186 pairs. I estimate 250 to 300 pairs in the state today. The population is really booming now. So peregrine falcon recovery is a great success story. And again, I have my students memorize these two sentences. A little bit of bumper sticker wisdom that I think applies to all walks of life. Never doubt that a few thoughtful, committed people can change the world. And that's really what happened with the peregrine recovery and bald eagles. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So here's a few of the thoughtful, committed people. Principally Jim Roush, who came up to UC Santa Cruz in 1975 and met with Ken Norris. Jim Roush is still a veterinarian in the area. You ever had a dog that was that had an ACL injury? Jim Roush is probably the guy who fixed it. Okay, he's a surgeon. ACL, anterior cruciate ligament, is the back of the knee. People have that problem too, but he fixes them in dogs. He came up to the university and talked to Ken Norris. Ken Norris said, "So you want to breed peregrine falcons here at the university?" And Jim said yes. And release them back in the wild throughout California. And Jim said yes. And Ken said, "Well, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't we do that? You know, where do you find I hesitate to call Ken a bureaucrat, but where do you find a person in power who says, sure, that sounds like a good idea, even though it's pretty kind of wild?" Representative of the Fish and Game Department, Brian Walton, who was the staff person that they hired to oversee this project back in the mid-70s. So, I just can't really see. So, we have this wild idea to take a piece of land down in Big Sur and dedicate it to wildlife and to restoring bald eagles. And there are several challenges, but the people, again, those few thoughtful people, there are two of them down in Carmel Valley. A veterinarian named Jerry Petkus and a friend of his who's actually a realtor, Sal Lucido, and then board member Jim Roush. And these guys got together and they cooked up this wild idea to release bald eagles. And Jim Roush called me, and at the time I was living in Yuma, Arizona, working on the recovery of Harris hawks out in the middle of the godforsaken desert. And I thought, boy, Big Sur, that sounds pretty good. Sign me up. So they didn't have much money, but they had this idea and they had a piece of land. They said, well, Glenn, you can come up and work with us, but you're going to have to find the money to fund this project. And I thought, well, that sounds all right. And our proposal to the Bald Eagle working team was to achieve their goal. So when you have the Endangered Species Act, a plan is created to recover that species. That's the way the Endangered Species Act works. And so California was split up into regions, and the Central Coast region had a recovery goal of 4 pairs of bald eagles. That was their goal. We came along and we said, we will achieve your goal, and it's not going to cost you anything because we'll find the money. And you'd think that there'd be a lot of rejoicing and jubilation. It didn't quite work out that way. So here are the challenges that we had. It was a wilderness area surrounding this chunk of 240 acres in Big Sur where that Sal and Jerry own. People in the community were a little, they looked at this askance because after all, Sal was a real estate salesperson. They thought, gee whiz, I don't know, I'm not sure you're really committed to dedicating this property to wildlife. So we had to convince the community that we were really going to do what we said. We had to convince the permitting agencies, and this is where I expected to see rejoicing, but we didn't have any. There were really a lot of obstacles that they put up in their way, and probably that's appropriate. You can't let just anybody come out and fool around with endangered species. But after all, I was an affiliate of the university in the predatory bird group and had been working for many years with a non-existent population of Harris hawks and restoring them successfully. And my colleague Brian Walton had been working along on peregrine falcons. We had a good track record with peregrine falcons, so it seemed sensible to me to go to them with a proposal that was modeled after the peregrine falcon recovery. And you know, I'll just tell you right off, here's the way things work. In order to get this thing rolling, we finally went to our state senators and assemblymen and asked them to talk to the Fish and Game Department and convince them this was a good idea. And finally they did. You know, that we would give them this gift of a project to restore bald eagles. So sometimes, you know, biology and politics get all wrapped up in the same bundle. And then, of course, we had to fund it, and we had a number of logistical issues to make this happen. So the first logistical issue was setting up a place for the baby bald eagles once we got them. And it was a huge challenge because, again, we try to be respectful of the fact that we're surrounded by wilderness. So we were committed to not using any power tools. We did not fire up a generator down there. And we used all hand tools to build towers out of telephone poles that we hand dug the holes for into the side of the mountain that was full of big chunks of limestone. But people would meet us in a parking lot in Carmel Valley on Saturday morning while most people were sleeping in or having a big breakfast down by the beach. They'd meet us, and we take that long drive down into the middle of the wilderness, and they do stuff like stand up, you know, dig holes and stand telephone poles up in them, and climb up and build these towers so that we'd have a place for the eaglets. And then one of the big challenges, of course, is where are we going to get the baby eagles? And I was able to make a deal with the Ministry of Environment in British Columbia, where they hadn't used so much DDT up there, and they still had plenty of bald eagles up there along the coast of British Columbia. And the biologist up there was kind of keen on our project, and he said, well, sure, you can come up here and get some eagles. And we both agreed that the best thing to do would be to locate nests that had 2 babies in them, leave one for mom and dad to raise, and bring one to Big Sur with us, and do that at 12 nests. As some of you may be aware, bald eagles suffer from what they call the Cain and Abel syndrome in the nest, where the baby that's born a couple days earlier kind of hammers on the other baby, and in most cases you only get one eaglet out of a nest. So that was a little bit of a challenge, and of course just getting to the place to do the collections. This is the tip of Vancouver Island was our collection area. A lot of wild country up there, accessible mostly by boat, not many roads. And for example, I mean, this is a beautiful area, a very remote area. If you ever want to take a trip someplace interesting, Port Hardy is kind of the end of the earth up there. And right along here is a place where orcas come from quite a distance around. It's a rubbing beach. And the orcas come there and rub on a kind of a unique gravel on the floor of the ocean right there. And you can go out in boats, and they have little tours. You can go on and see a concentration of orcas up there. Well, that's where we went to collect baby bald eagles. This is what it looks like from the air. And we did our surveys from a helicopter, and perfect place for a bald eagle and nest is right here, maybe out here on this point, where they can look out, see the fish going by, and capture them and deliver them to their young. So I went for a helicopter ride with the biologist up there in British Columbia, searching for nests. We'd map the nests, mark them. This was a long time ago. We marked them on the on the maps, and in most cases, and again, these trees were seriously hard to find when we went back to them. So we'd throw a streamer of that fluorescent surveyor's tape out the door of the helicopter that would hopefully catch on the tree and mark it so we could find it when we came back, on foot or in a boat. And sometimes we'd see the tree in the distance and mark a compass course and then walk in on the compass course, because you know, if the eagles are in this tree and you climb this tree, you're completely out of luck. This is what the eagle's nests look like from the air. And you know, they're not really very hard to find. An eagle's nest is about the size of the back of a pickup truck, and it's got a giant white-headed bird standing next to it. And so this is one of our lucky nests that had 2 babies in it. So this is one of the places that we marked and planned to come back to and climb. And as we were surveying for the eagles, I happened to look away from the nest, and there was an eagle rolling into a dive right up here, and I just, you know, by instinct said, well, there's an eagle at 10 o'clock, and the pilot looked up, he saw that, because eagles are known to crash through the bubble of helicopters when they're in nest defense, and so he pushed the stick kind of over and to the right, and the helicopter did a sickening roll. And my wife will tell you, I'm not good on rides down here at the boardwalk. So that's how we got this picture. That I was over here hanging onto a tree for a few minutes while we rested and then went on with our survey. So then we've got to get the eagles, right? Now we know where the nests are, we know where a dozen nests are, and we'd look at about 60 nests in order to find a dozen that had 2 babies in them. We rented these giant vans at the airport in Vancouver, took out all of the seats except the front seats and the back seat, filled it up with gear and sky kennels for the eagles to ride in, and in most cases went out in boats and then hiked through the forest, found the tree, climbed the trees. While we were climbing the trees, Carol, this is the Ministry of Environment's wife, would fish for food to feed the eagles. So yeah, red snapper, not a bad meal. And we'd get them out every morning and every evening while we were building up our collection of eagles and feed them. Now, this is a bow and arrow, but you'll notice that there's a fishing reel attached to the bow. This is how we got our first line about 60 or 70 feet up the tree where the first branch was. So we put a piece of fishing line over the branch, pull up a light line, and use that one to pull up a climbing rope, and then do the Jumar ascender thing until we get to the point where the climber could use climbing spikes. And of course, eagles, having a 7-foot wingspan, always choose the tallest tree in the forest because they don't want to maneuver through the branches in order to land at their nest. They want the sentinel tree. So we always had to go to the tallest tree where they could just easily land right at the very tip top of it. The climbers would disappear into the canopy, and so we communicated by a headset up there, and we could see what was going on. On one trip that we went on, CBS Evening News came up there with us, and again, this is the 80s. This is before all the fancy little cameras that we have, and the climber actually pulled a cable all the way up to the nest with him, planted the camera on the side of the nest so that we could have images of eagles in the nest for Dan Rather's Evening News. And we got to watch a monitor too, and it was pretty cool. I've been asked other times that I've done this talk if we selected evenly for males and females when we went to these nests. We did not, I confess. I never even thought about it. We chose the eagle that was closest. They got a 5-foot wide nest, and a guy, you know, his arm is this long. You get the one that you can reach. And that's what my friend Terry, a climber, would say, okay, who wants to go to California? And they get packed into a duffel bag and lowered to the ground on a long line. Well, that's so they wouldn't have to ride down on Terry's back, right? Those are the options. What are you going to do? So we'd send them down, and we'd put a hood on them and get them back to the van, and they'd relax in a sky kennel. And this is my friend Russell Tucker. Russell lived here in Santa Cruz for many years. He's now teaching veterinary medicine, but he was a young veterinarian at the time. And besides being a good photograph for the Patagonia catalog, which they did not take it. I sent it to him. I thought they'd not take it. But it kind of illustrates what was going on up there. And you see the eagle's got a hood on it to keep it calm as it's being carried back to our van. This is feeding time for the eagles. You see that, you see the size of the feet? This is a 6-week-old baby eagle. Wow. The size of its feet. And of course the beak is very threatening. And we use that to our advantage to be sure that they ate every day. We take pieces of fish meat from, remember the red snapper, and you hold a piece of meat like this, not like this, you hold it like this. So the big beak comes along. When they snap at you, they get a mouthful of food. And we'd fill them up with food every day in that way. So one guy was a holder and one guy was the feeder. There we go. I forgot I had a picture of it. So back down to the release site. Now we've got 12 eaglets, and they're this big, each one of them. They all ride in a extra large sky kennel. The image of the eagles being loaded on the plane is something I'll never forget. You know, you see the little train of baggage that comes out to the, well, this train had 12 sky kennels on it instead of suitcases, riding out to the belly of the 747, and the eagles went in, and the engineer came up and asked me what temperature I'd like them to be added. You know, so we kept them cool and landed at San Francisco Airport. And then they traveled by a train of cars, vehicles, all the way down to our release site in Big Sur, and went up into the enclosures that we built, that were built by these volunteers. That's what it looked like. You're up at 2,300 feet. Beautiful view out over the ocean. Most of the time we were above the fog layer up there. The eagles would leave this tower, explore the area. They'd go over the ridge, out into the Salinas Valley. We'd watch them. These are not release site attendants. My wife, Anna. This is the 25-year-old wife of a biologist who kind of held it all together while that Glenn, he's gone again. That's my 2-year-old daughter and what will be my son right here. And they come down and live with me down in Big Sur while the release took place. And it took a couple of months, about 2.5 months, to get the eagles to independence from, so we'd get them at 7 weeks old. We'd raise them to 11.5 weeks old inside of that tower, inside of the enclosure. Then we'd remove the bars around the outside of the enclosure, give them their freedom, and then they begin short flights and longer flights, and all the while we're putting food up there for them. In the case of the peregrine falcons, they were quail, commercially raised quail. In the case of the eagles, they're pretty big eaters, so we had fish being caught by volunteers and deer that were killed, fallow deer that were killed up on Point Reyes because they're an invasive species, and dumped off in the meadow where I would meet the rangers and cut them up and quarter them and load them into the back of our family car and drive them down to Big Sur. Where you sort of get the picture of how all this works. That there's a facility on Anderson Peak near our release site down there that is part of Vandenberg Air Force Base. Little known facility, but they have an observatory up there where they film. Every missile launch at Vandenberg is filmed at Anderson Peak in Big Sur. So they have electricity. That was a big deal for us. We ran a extension cord through their fence line. Of course, they were happy to have us do this. And had a freezer standing outside the fence that we'd keep our eagle food in. It's hard for me to get a really clear picture for everybody of what it's kind of a challenge out there in the middle of nowhere to do this. So anyway, that's what they look like inside the enclosure, and that's what the telemetry looks like. We put a backpack transmitter on them, 20 grams, backpack mounted, so there are 4 half-inch Teflon sleeving straps that come around, and then those 4 straps are connected by one piece of cotton thread. And so when the cotton thread breaks, the transmitter is shed. And once a week I'd go up in an airplane and tour the area and find out where our eagles were, and they would travel widely. They had the ability to eat a lot. They would take a couple of days and they'd go exploring out over the Salinas Valley, north to Carmel Valley, but they always would return to our little platform to eat. So this was about a 10-year effort. We released 10 or 12 birds each year between 1986 and about 1994, I think, was the last year they were released. I told you the evening news came down and filmed all this. They went to Alaska with us to Canada with us to film this. And again, it was a great success story. By the early 1990s, we started getting eaglets, nesting birds. It takes 5 years for bald eagles to mature. And we've had a steadily increasing production of eagles over the years, to the point where now we've got pairs all throughout the Central Coast region. They're up here around Livermore, quite a few down here in the Big Sur region, and it all started with the release of a few eagles. I've written these stories down, the story of the bald eagle releases, and 16 other stories of fun with birds of prey, from Alaska to Arizona to the Grand Tetons, working with goshawks and Harris hawks and bald eagles and golden eagles over the years. And this ebook that I published is a cornerstone of my retirement program, so I urge you all to have a look at it on Amazon. Thanks a lot.
Glenn, are you willing to take questions if anyone has them?
Did I cover everything, or is there a question?
Usually there.
Do you have a question for Anna?
Glenn.
She was there. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is, how difficult was it to be removing babies when you've got parents, and how do you protect yourself? I mean, it seems like.
Yeah. Okay. First question is, how difficult was it to release? How difficult was it to remove babies from nests when you have parents there? And surprisingly, because I told the story about the eagle that wanted to attack our helicopter, and that's a pretty scary deal. But both, thankfully, bald eagles and golden eagles are very reclusive around the nest. And when humans approach their nest tree, they become very scarce. I think they watch, but from a great distance. So it was no problem at all.
And I know that at least with the condor part of the problem continues to be lead in at the hunting areas around Big Sur. And I'm just wondering, do you see that with the eagles? I saw a slight decline on your graph at the end, and what's that due to?
The second question is about condors, lead. Is lead an issue for bald eagles? I'm sure it is. I'm sure. Bald eagles eat all kinds of stuff. They eat some carrion. They do eat carrion, but it's not a key, it's not a principal part of their diet like it is for condors. So we're not seeing it inhibiting the recovery of bald eagles like it is inhibiting the recovery of condors. I didn't really say, we were trying to get 4 pairs of bald eagles in the Central Coast region, and there are 26 pairs today. So it's a great success story for Ventana and for wildlife management and overcoming this really mistake we made with DDT. Condors, I'll just go on a tangent here for a second. Condors have several problems, and we're just going to have to see where that goes. I think that the idea is we're going to try and keep them on Earth while we figure out all the problems. But personally, I don't see what the big deal is about giving up lead ammunition. There are other kinds of projectiles. Condors still suffer from DDT contamination. It's out of the food chain for bald eagles and peregrine falcons. Still in the food chain for condors because the floor of the ocean in an area called the LA Bight, that's basically between the Channel Islands and Los Angeles, is heavily contaminated with DDT. For many years, when Montrose was manufacturing it down there, it went right out the storm sewers. Then they started putting it in casks and delivering it by boat into the deep ocean. But it was a foggy day, the boat drivers didn't want to go out that far, and they'd just throw it over the side on the way to Catalina. So there's this DDT on the floor of the ocean, the invertebrates are contaminated with it, the fish eat it, the sea lions eat the fish, and then the sea lions swim up to Big Sur where they eventually they die and are eaten by condors, and so that's a DDT. So condors actually still have an eggshell thinning problem. And then to cap it all off, condors are evolved, they're growing a baby, they're this big, over a 6-month period in their nest, and it requires a lot of food, and it requires a lot of calcium. And so condors would actually go, historically, they cleaned up tule elk that were killed by grizzly bears out in the Central Valley, which was lakes and streams historically, right, before we got here, and put 1,200 dams along the, the Sierras. Well, condors would pick up pieces of bone at these kill sites and feed it to their babies along with the meat that they delivered. Not finding these kill piles, condors go out and pick up things like a piece of porcelain and glass and electrical parts and feed them to their babies instead of the calcium that they need. And so the babies die at about 4 months old with a wad of glass in their gut about the size of a baseball. So that's another inhibitor for condors. So they have a lot of challenges. Yes?
Well, Well, I'm a wildlife biologist out of San Mateo State, Dr. Richard Maywall, many years ago. So I'm trying to make something. My travel, I've been in 50 countries, and one of them was working in East Africa. And this has to do with bald eagles, because both in Ethiopia and in Kenya, I've lots of lakes in the Rift Zone, and here would be these bald fish eagles.
Yeah.
And they weren't, of course, there weren't the bald eagles here. And then later on, it's even more peculiar. I went on a scuba diving trip on the northwestern tip of Papua New Guinea. And I was on a boat, and we were scuba diving these rocks, little rocks, miles of jagged rocks. And here a white-headed eagle.
Where is that?
This is, you have to go down, it's in Indonesia. You're going to Indonesia, and you go on down to the northwest from Serong in the north tip. That's the oil fields are. And we're just around there. It was a fantastic trip for scuba diving. But these eagles, both these eagles had white heads, and there were fish eagles in the ocean. The one, at least I remember, in Indonesia was gray eagle.
Right. So the comment is that there are similar eagles. We have the bald eagle. There's a stellar sea eagle that looks pretty similar to a bald eagle. It has a larger white, kind of goes down its back a little bit, and they have more eagles in Africa than we do.
You know, I worked in East Africa for 4 years. I'm very fortunate to be there. Except for Somalia, forget about that.
Yeah. So I'll stick with right. There are other sea eagles that are similar.
I was just curious. So there are, but the white heads got me every time.
Yeah.
I used to ride my bicycle in the hills east of Hollister back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I saw a number of golden eagles back there, but I think there were 2 times that I saw bald eagles, and I wondered if they might have been, they seemed like they were just passing through.
Where?
The hills east of Hollister. You know, it's like a little bit east of the...
What year?
About let's say 1990.
Okay.
Would they have been...
So the question was, were there eagles in outside of Hollister in the early 1990s? You know, we saw a golden eagle up here at the university not too long ago, and it had such a blonde head that someone commented that looks like a bald eagle. Do you think that could have been the case?
Well, I saw golden eagles up there much more frequently. But there were a couple of times I just saw a white-headed eagle with a white tail or looked like a white-headed eagle with a white tail just passing through, like it was flying over.
Hey, could